It is November 28th, 1443. The air over the Albanian mountains bites like a blade. Cold, sharp, unforgiving. Snow has begun to dust the peaks around Kruja, that ancient fortress city clinging to its limestone ridge like a fist refusing to let go of a cliff. The stars are out, brilliant and merciless, and by their pale light 300 horsemen move through the darkness below. They ride in silence. No torches, no war drums, not yet. Their leader is a man of 38 years, broad-shouldered, tall in the saddle, with a face that has seen both the gilded halls of the Ottoman court and the blood-soaked fields of a dozen campaigns. His name, the name the Turks gave him, is Skanderbeg, Lord Alexander. But tonight, for the first time in 20 years, he is not riding for the Sultan. Tonight, he is riding home. In his saddlebag sits a letter, a forged letter, bearing a seal it has no right to carry, and with that single piece of parchment, Gheorghe Castriotti, the man history would remember as Skanderbeg, was about to do something that no one in the Balkans had dared attempt in a generation. He was about to look the most powerful empire on earth directly in the face and say, "Not here, not my people, not my land." Now think about what that actually meant. The Ottoman Empire in 1443 was not some regional bully. It was a war machine that had been grinding kingdoms into dust for nearly a century. Serbia, Bulgaria, much of Greece, piece by piece, swallowed whole. Their armies moved like a steel tide, tens of thousands strong, equipped with the finest artillery in the known world, funded by the wealth of 3 continents. When Sultan Murad II decided a city needed to fall, it fell. When he decided a rebellion needed to die, it died. No exceptions, no miracles. And against all of that, against an empire of millions, Skanderbeg rode with 300 men. But here is what makes this story different from every other doomed rebellion you've ever heard of. Here is what makes November 28th, 1443, one of the most consequential nights in European history. He won. Not just once, not just a skirmish. For 25 years, marking 25 years of blood and fire and betrayal and siege and famine, this one man and his small, fractured, perpetually outnumbered Albanian army held back the Ottoman tide. And in doing so, he may have saved Western civilization itself from being swallowed whole. So how does a man who spent half his life serving the empire he would spend the other half destroying actually pull this off? What turns a loyal Ottoman commander into the most dangerous rebel in Europe? And what does it feel like to look at 100,000 enemy soldiers outside your walls and think, we can win this? Stick around, because this is one of the greatest military stories ever told, and it deserves to be told right. If you're watching from Albania, drop a comment below. I want to know. If you've never heard of Skanderbeg before today, hit subscribe, because the story we're about to tell should have been in every history textbook on the planet. This is the betrayal that shook an empire. Let's go. To understand what Skanderbeg did, you first need to understand what he was walking away from and walking into. The Ottoman Empire of the 1440s was a machine built for one purpose: expansion. It had been doing exactly that without significant interruption since the mid-14th century, when its armies first crossed from Anatolia into Europe. And Europe, it turned out, was very, very conquerable. The Battle of Kosovo in 1389 had broken Serbian military power so thoroughly that the kingdom became a vassal state before it even had time to grieve its dead. Bulgaria went next, then much of Thrace. Then pieces of Macedonia, chunks of Greece, great swaths of the Balkans that had once been separate principalities with their own languages, their own laws, their own churches, absorbed, reorganized, rebranded as Ottoman territory, administered through a system called the Timar. The Timar system was elegant in its ruthlessness. Was when the Ottoman army conquered a region, the local feudal lords, The men who had owned that land for generations, who had built their identities and their families' honour around it, were replaced. Ottoman Sipahi cavalry, loyal to the Sultan and only to the Sultan, received grants of land in exchange for military service. The old Albanian nobility, the men who had held these valleys and these mountain fortresses since their grandfathers' grandfathers were children, suddenly found themselves either dead, exiled, or reduced to Ottoman vassals, paying tribute to a court in distant Edirne that did not speak their language and did not share their god. The Albanian peasantry had it worse. Under the Timar, a Spahi was essentially a tax collector with a sword. He could extract what he needed, and need in that system was defined generously. The Albanian farmers who had worked the same terraced fields for centuries now found themselves contributing to an empire they had never agreed to join. And the Albanian mountains had always bred a particular kind of person, stubborn, proud, not naturally inclined towards submission. So rebellion had been smouldering in Albania for years before Skanderbeg made his move. The most significant earlier attempt, the revolt led by the nobleman Gjergj Arianiti between 1432 and 1436, had mobilized large sections of northern and central Albania and given the Ottomans a genuine headache before being suppressed. When that rebellion broke out, Skanderbeg's relatives actually sent word to him, begging him to come home and join the fight. He didn't come, he stayed with the Sultan. He helped crush rebellions across the Balkans for the empire that had taken him from his family as a child hostage. He was, by every external measure, a model Ottoman servant. But something was happening beneath the surface. Gjergj Kastrioti had been taken to the Ottoman court around 1414, one of 4 sons sent by his father Gjon Kastrioti as a guarantee of loyalty, a common practice called the devshirme, a blood tax, where Christian noble families surrendered their children to be raised in the Islamic faith and trained as warriors for the Sultan. The idea was brilliant in its psychological cruelty. You take a man's son, raise that son as your own, turn him into your finest weapon, and in doing so, you bind the father's loyalty through the child's very existence. Break free, and your son dies. Rebel, and you kill your own blood. Gjergj thrived in the Ottoman system. This was not a man crushed by his circumstances. He attended the Enderun School, the elite Ottoman military academy, and proved himself an exceptional student of both warfare and statecraft. He rose through the ranks of the Janissary Corps, the Sultan's elite troops, recruited from exactly this devshirme process, with a speed that drew the Sultan's personal attention and favour. By 1440, he had been appointed Sanjak Bey, military governor of the Sanjak of Dibra, a district in the Albanian heartland. He knew how the Ottoman army fought. He knew its strengths and its blind spots. He knew the psychology of its commanders. He understood the Timar system from the inside. Its efficiency, yes, but also its brittleness, the resentment it generated. In the local knowledge it threw away in favour of loyalty to a distant throne. And he understood something else. The Ottoman Empire, for all its power, ruled Albania through Albanians. The soldiers who enforced Ottoman law in these mountain villages were often local men. The commanders who led punitive expeditions against Albanian rebels sometimes spoke Albanian themselves. The empire had not conquered Albania so much as it had absorbed it, which meant the conquest was never really complete, never really digested, never fully secure. His father, Gjon Kastrioti, died while Skanderbeg was still serving in Edirne. The man's domain had been gradually reduced, squeezed by Ottoman pressure, his lands parcelled out. And when Gjon died, Sultan Murad did not give those lands to Gjergj. He gave them to another janissary, a man with no connection to Albania, a stranger. That was the moment. Not a sudden conversion, not a single thunderclap of revelation, just the cold arithmetic of a man who had given 20 years to a system that had just told him, clearly and without apology, that he would never truly belong to it. Now, understand the man on the other side of this story. Sultan Murad II was not a fool. He was not the kind of ruler who stumbled into conquests. He engineered them. He had spent decades building the most efficient military administrative apparatus in the world, and he had an eye for talent that made him deeply dangerous. He knew Skanderbeg was exceptional. He had promoted him, honoured him, given him command positions of real responsibility. Which is precisely why, when the news arrived that Skanderbeg had deserted at Niš, he had forged an imperial order, had seized Kruja, had declared himself the avenger of his family and his people, the Sultan's reaction was not anger. It was something colder than anger. It was the look of a man recalculating, realizing that he had built his enemy's education himself. And now, consider the civilizational stakes. Constantinople was still standing in 1443. The Byzantine Empire, battered and reduced to little more than the city itself, still existed. The kingdoms of Hungary, Serbia, and Albania formed a ragged Christian frontier against Ottoman expansion into Central and Western Europe. The crusading spirit, though fading, had not entirely died. Hungarian warlord John Hunyadi was still launching campaigns, still fighting, still trying to organize the Christian powers into a coherent resistance, but those powers were losing. Hungary fought brilliantly and still lost battles. Serbia was already a vassal. The despotate of the Morea in Greece was crumbling. If the Ottoman army could push through Albania, that narrow mountainous corridor along the Adriatic coast, it would have a clear path toward Italy, toward Rome, toward the heart of Catholic Europe. The men who understood geopolitics in 1443 understood this. The Pope understood it. The Italian city-states understood it. And Skanderbeg understood it, perhaps better than anyone, because he had seen the Ottoman war machine from the inside, had watched it plan and execute and advance. And he knew that if Albania fell quickly, the next conversation would be about how to defend Venice. What was at stake in that Albanian mountain, Fauj, was not just one family's honour. It was not just the independence of one small, fractured nation. It was the question of whether the Ottoman tide would roll all the way to the Atlantic, or whether someone, somewhere, somehow, would make it stop. 300 men rode through the dark toward Kruja, and somehow, impossibly, the tide was about to stop. But here is the thing about tides. They do not stop easily. They do not stop painlessly. And they do not stop without cost that defies imagination. The Ottoman Empire that Skanderbeg was about to defy could field armies of 100,000 men. Its treasury-funded campaigns that lasted for years without straining the budget. Its engineers could build siege works faster than defenders could repair walls. Its cavalry could pursue a retreating army across hundreds of miles of terrain. Its intelligence networks stretched across the Balkans, into the courts of European kingdoms, into the monasteries and market towns and mountain villages of every land it touched. And Albania had goats. Albania had mountains. Albania had stubborn farmers who had not yet been broken. And it had one man who knew both sides of the war he was about to start. That would have to be enough. Before a single arrow flew in the name of Albanian independence, before the League of Leisure was even a dream in anyone's mind, the ground itself had to be understood. Because in the war, Skanderbeg intended to fight. The land was not merely background. The land was his army. Albania is not a country that encourages complacency in those who try to move through it. The Albanian Alps in the north rise to nearly 9,000 feet. Yet their ridges jagged and unforgiving. Their passes narrow enough that a determined handful of men can hold them against 1,000. The valleys between these peaks do not open gently into wide plains. They cut and twist, offering sudden ambush points every half mile. forcing any army that enters them to string itself out in a long, vulnerable column, rather than deploying in the broad formations that gave Ottoman cavalry its terrifying power. The coastal lowlands, where modern Albania's cities now stand, are a different matter. Flatter, more open, more hospitable to the kind of large-scale cavalry engagements where the Ottomans excelled. Skanderbeg understood this distinction with an engineer's precision. He would never fight on flat ground if he could possibly avoid it. The mountains were home. The mountains were salvation. Kruja itself sat on a limestone ridge at roughly 2,000 feet of elevation, protected on three sides by sheer cliffs that no assault force could scale under fire. Its single accessible approach ran from the east, along a narrow mountain road that an attacker had to climb exposed for hundreds of yards before reaching the outer walls. The fortress's water supply came from internal cisterns fed by mountain springs, a fact that would prove decisive during the Great Siege of 1450. Its walls, thickened and reinforced over generations, were built from the same grey limestone as the ridge itself, making them almost invisible at a distance and nearly impervious to the artillery technology of the era. This was the heart of Skanderbeg's strategy. Not the seizure of Kruja alone, but what Kruja represented. An anchor point. A place that could not easily be taken, a symbol around which resistance could coalesce. While Kruja held, Albania had a centre. While Kruja held, there was somewhere for refugees to flee, for supplies to be stored, for the League's leadership to meet in relative safety. But a fortress by itself is just a very expensive place to be besieged. The real military question was how to use the terrain beyond those walls. In the weeks after seizing Kruja in November 1443, Skanderbeg moved with stunning speed. He did not sit in his fortress and wait for Ottoman retaliation. He understood that the Ottoman response would come, and that it would be massive, and that his only chance of surviving it was to control the ground before the Ottomans arrived. He swept through the surrounding region, capturing the smaller fortresses at Betrayal, Prisi, Skuriebada, Svetigrad, and Modric in rapid succession. Each of these positions blocked a potential Ottoman approach route or controlled a mountain pass. Taken together, they formed a defensive network, not a wall because no wall could stretch across that terrain, but a web of strong points that forced any invading army to divide and hesitate. He was also building something else, something harder to see on a military map, but more important than any individual fortress. He was building a coalition. The Albanian nobility of the 1440s was not a unified force. It was a collection of feuding families, each with their own territorial ambitions, their own grudges against their neighbours, their own complicated histories of cooperation and betrayal with the Ottomans. The Arianiti family controlled large portions of central Albania and had already led one rebellion. The Dukagjini clan dominated the north and had a reputation for fierce independence that sometimes tipped into outright belligerence toward anyone who tried to lead them, including other Albanians. The Muzaka, the Zaharia, the Thopia, the Zenevisi, each of these families had their own men, their own castles, their own calculations about who was worth fighting for and when. Getting them into the same room without someone being stabbed was already an achievement. Getting them to agree to a unified command, and specifically to agree that the unified commander would be Skanderbeg, was something else entirely. The meeting at Leisure on March 2nd, 1444, was convened on Venetian-controlled territory, which was deliberate. Venice was the dominant external power on Albania's coast, and holding the meeting in a Venetian town meant there was at least some neutral ground, some diplomatic cushion, preventing the gathering from immediately dissolving into the kind of interclan violence that had plagued Albanian politics for decades. The powerful Albanian noble families came: Arianiti, Dukagjini, Muzaka, Zaharia, Thopia, Zenevisi, Dushmani, Spani. The Serbian nobleman Stefan Krnojević of Zeta attended as well, lending the gathering a broader Balkan dimension. The arguments were fierce. Leka Dukagjini, whose family had the most to lose from accepting outside leadership, reportedly questioned Skanderbeg's loyalties directly. Here was a man who had served the Ottoman Empire for 20 years, who had fought against Albanian rebels while his own countrymen bled. What guarantee was there that this was not an Ottoman operation designed to lure the Albanian nobility into one place where they could be identified, catalogued, and eventually eliminated? It was Gjörgj Arianiti, himself a veteran rebel, who answered most forcefully. Skanderbeg knew how the Ottoman army thought. He knew its commanders by name, its tactics by heart, its weaknesses from having exploited them on the Sultan's behalf for 2 decades. If you wanted to fight the Ottomans effectively, you needed someone who had been inside the machine. You needed this man. Skanderbeg said little. According to later accounts, he placed the banner of the double-headed black eagle, the Castriotti family crest, the symbol he had carried in secret since the night he seized Kruja, on the table in front of the assembled lords. He did not make speeches about freedom or glory. He asked them a single question. Do you want to survive? The League of Leisure was formed that day. Skanderbeg was named Commander-in-Chief. Each lord retained authority over his own territory and the right to withdraw, a provision that would cause enormous headaches in the years ahead, as individual nobles defected, reconciled, defected again, and occasionally fought each other, even while nominally fighting the Ottomans together. But for the moment, for the first time in Albanian history, much of the country was operating under a single military command, now the force itself. By the spring of 1444, Skanderbeg had assembled an army of approximately 8,000 to 10,000 regular troops, with another 10,000 reserves that could be called up from the League's member territories. These numbers are important to hold in your head, because they represent the absolute ceiling of what he could field without stripping Albania's farms and villages of every man capable of carrying a weapon. In a good year, with all the lords cooperating. The Ottoman Empire, by contrast, could and regularly did deploy armies of 40 to 100,000 men against Albanian targets, drawing on the vast manpower reserves of a polity that stretched from modern-day Hungary to the borders of Persia. The mismatch was not merely numerical. The Ottomans had artillery, bronze cannon, and iron-balled bombards that could reduce stone walls to rubble if given enough time. They had the finest cavalry in the region, the Sipahi horsemen who trained from childhood and rode horses bred for warfare. They had the Janissaries, the elite infantry corps, to disciplined and fanatical, willing to die for the Sultan in ways that feudal levies simply were not. Skanderbeg had knotted Albanian mountain fighters who were used to hunger, cold, and vertical terrain. He had light cavalry that could cover ground at a speed that consistently surprised Ottoman commanders, trained to think of cavalry as shock troops, not guerrilla raiders. He had archers and crossbowmen who had been hunting in these mountains since they could walk, and could pick a man off a moving horse at distances that Ottoman soldiers found almost impossible to credit. Most of all, he had something the Ottomans could never buy: intimate knowledge of the ground. His strategy, reduced to its simplest form, had 3 components. First, never fight a set-piece battle on open terrain, yet where Ottoman numbers and firepower would be overwhelming. Second, use the mountains aggressively, forcing any invading army to stretch itself along narrow roads where it could be struck from multiple directions simultaneously. Third, when the enemy besieges a fortress, don't just defend it, attack the besiegers' supply lines until they starve or sicken and leave. This last element was the most counterintuitive and the most brilliant. Every other European commander, faced with a large Ottoman siege army, would have done the same thing, pulled their forces into the fortress and prayed. Skanderbeg did something different. He left a garrison, usually a small one, 1,500 men, enough to hold the walls, and took the rest of his army outside into the surrounding hills, where it functioned as a constantly mobile strike force, targeting every supply convoy, every foraging party, every messenger trying to reach the besieging army with reinforcements or ammunition. The men inside the walls suffered, but so did the men outside. And the men outside had much further to travel to get more food. There was a moment, before the first great trial came, that history almost missed. The night before the League of Leisure was formalised, a young Albanian fighter, we do not know his name, we will never know his name, sat outside the walls of Leisure in the cold and sharpened his blade. He was perhaps 17, perhaps 20, drawn into Skanderbeg's growing force from one of the villages along the Drin River. He had never been to the Ottoman court. He had never met a sultan. He knew the Ottomans only as the soldiers who had collected his father's grain for the past decade and left the family barely enough to survive the winter. He ran his whetstone along the edge of his sword in long, careful strokes, watching the sparks drift upward like brief stars. He was thinking about his mother. He was thinking about whether she knew where he was. He was thinking about whether what he was about to do made any sense at all. Not far away, Skanderbeg sat alone with his own thoughts. 20 years of Ottoman campaigns. 20 years of watching the empire devour everything in its path. He had served loyally. He had fought brilliantly. He had been rewarded, promoted, trusted. And his father's land had gone to a stranger. He looked east, where the Ottoman territories began. He looked at the banner folded in his hands. He had been given the name of Alexander the Great by his Ottoman masters, a name they intended as a compliment. Tonight, in the cold before a gathering that would decide whether Albania lived or died, he wondered if perhaps they had been more prophetic than they knew. The war council ended. The lords went to their tents. The young soldier with no name finally stopped sharpening his blade, tucked it against his side, and lay down on the cold ground and slept. Tomorrow, everything would begin. The first test came faster than most of the League's lords had expected. In the summer of 1444, Sultan Murad II sent Ali Pasha of Edirne into Albania with an army estimated at between 20 and 25,000 men. Ali Pasha was not a careless commander. He was not a man sent with a punitive raiding force. This was a deliberate, well-organised military expedition intended to crush the rebellion before it could take root, to make an example of Skanderbeg and the League in terms so brutal that no Albanian lord would consider defiance for a generation. Ali Pasha was also, it must be said, somewhat overconfident. The Ottoman army entered Albanian territory in late June, moving up through the valley system south of the Shkumbin River, where the terrain was relatively open, better suited to cavalry operations, more familiar to commanders used to the rolling plains of Thrace and Anatolia. The force moved in the standard Ottoman formation, a vanguard of Akinci light cavalry screening the advance, the main body of Sipahi heavy cavalry, and Janissary infantry moving in disciplined columns behind, the supply train trailing at the rear, protected by a rearguard detachment. As it was efficient, it was professional. It was exactly what had worked against every other Balkan opponent the Ottomans had faced in the past 50 years. But Ali Pasha had not fought Skanderbeg before. The Albanian scouts, men who knew every goat path and boulder field in that valley system, had been watching the Ottoman advance for days. They reported back with the kind of precision that comes from a lifetime of living in terrain, not merely passing through it. Skanderbeg knew the size of the force, its composition, its rate of advance, and, critically, the narrow defile near the village of Torviol, where the valley constricted and the hills closed in on both sides like a slowly tightening fist. He rode to that ground himself and stood there in silence for a long time. Then he gave his orders. The night before the battle, you Albanian fighters moved through the darkness to pre-assigned positions on the ridgelines above the valley floor. They moved without fire, without noise, with the practiced quiet of men who had spent their entire lives hunting in mountains. By the time the sun rose on the morning of the battle, there were Albanian soldiers on ground that Ali Pasha's scouts had not checked, because those ridgelines had seemed too steep, too remote, too inhospitable to host an ambush. They were wrong. Ali Pasha's army entered the defile at Torviol with the confidence of a force that had never been surprised. The vanguard moved through first, the dust of their passage rising in the summer heat. Then the main body began to funnel into the narrow section of valley, the column inevitably compressing, the horses crowding together. The disciplined spacing of the march formation beginning to collapse simply because the terrain didn't leave room for it. Silence. A single heartbeat of absolute stillness, so complete that men later swore they could hear the river 2 miles away. Then Skanderbeg gave the signal. From 3 ridgelines simultaneously, Albanian arrows and crossbow bolts came down like a black rain. The leading elements of the Ottoman column stumbled, men falling from horses screaming and rearing, the tight formation becoming a knot of panic in a matter of seconds. From the rear of the defile, Skanderbeg's light cavalry charged at a gallop, cutting off the retreat before the rear elements could turn around in the narrow space. The Ottoman formation, so lethal in open ground, so dependent on being able to spread and maneuver, was useless. The great Sipahi cavalry that had broken Serbian knights and Hungarian crusaders could not develop its charge in a space 20 yards wide. The Janissaries, some of the finest infantry in the world, were being shot from above by men they could barely see, and certainly could not reach. Ali Pasha tried to push forward, but the forward elements were already engaged with Albanian infantry that had come down the slopes with the terrifying speed of mountain fighters on home ground. And they were not pushing forward, they were fighting for their lives at close quarters, in ground so broken that military formation was meaningless. It took hours, but there was never really any doubt about how it would end. The Ottoman army broke. Ali Pasha survived, but his force did not. Shattered. Pursuing survivors hunted through the valleys, prisoners taken, that the surviving elements fleeing back toward the Ottoman frontier with the knowledge that something had gone very, very wrong. By that evening, Skanderbeg sat on his horse at the edge of the battlefield and looked at what had been done. Around him, Albanian fighters were moving through the defile, collecting weapons, checking the fallen. The mountains were quiet again, that deep mountain quiet that absorbs even the sounds of violence with its own indifference. News of Torviol spread across Europe in weeks. For the first time in living memory, an Ottoman army had been destroyed on European soil, not pushed back, not forced to retreat, but destroyed by a force a fraction of its size in a battle that lasted an afternoon. John Hunyadi in Hungary heard the news and understood its significance immediately. The Pope in Rome heard it and began drafting letters. The Italian city-states heard it and started doing the kind of political calculations that cities do when the balance of power shifts unexpectedly. Ottoman expansion into the Balkans had not stopped. But for the first time in a long time, someone had said, stop. And it had worked. But Torviol was only the beginning. It was the opening chord of a symphony that would take 25 years to play out fully, and not all of its movements would be triumphant. Phase 2, the siege, that should have broken everything. Cluj, Sama, 1450. By noon on a June day in 1450, every Albanian with eyes could see what was coming. The Ottoman force that appeared on the eastern approaches to Cluj that summer was unlike anything Albania had seen. It was not a punitive expedition. It was not a probing force. Sultan Murad II himself had come, riding at the head of an army that chronicles put at 100,000 men. And while medieval chroniclers are notoriously unreliable with numbers, even the conservative modern estimates agree that this force was immense, the largest the Ottomans had ever sent, specifically against Albanian targets. With Murad came his son, the young Mehmed, who would one day conquer Constantinople and set his sights on Rome. With Murad came artillery pieces dragged over mountain roads at enormous logistical expense, cannon capable of reducing stone walls that had stood for centuries. With Murad came the memory of every Albanian lord who had ever thought about rebelling against the Sultan and had then changed their mind. This was not a battle, this was a statement. But Skanderbeg had not spent 6 years building this resistance in order to be impressed by statements. His response was as counterintuitive as it was brilliant. He did not mass his forces inside Kruja. He gathered his commanders in the Great Hall and told them exactly what he intended to do. And the men who heard the plan remembered later that there was a moment of silence afterward. The particular silence of people who have just been told something so unexpected that their minds need a second to process it. He would leave 1,500 men in Kruja under the command of Vrana Conti, one of his most trusted lieutenants. Conti's orders were simple: hold the walls, do not surrender, do not negotiate, do not accept any offer the Ottomans make, regardless of how generous it sounds. And Skanderbeg himself would take the rest of the army, the majority of his forces, and disappear into the mountains, not to retreat, not to flee, to become a ghost. While Murad's 100,000 men settled into siege positions around Kruja, building their camps, deploying their cannon, establishing their supply depots and their command structures, and all the elaborate infrastructure that a force that size requires just to exist, Skanderbeg's mobile army was already in the hills above them watching. The first supply convoy that tried to reach the Ottoman camp from the east was hit before it got within 10 miles of Kruja. The escort was killed or scattered, the supplies burned, the animals driven off. 2 days later, a foraging party sent into the valleys to supplement the army's dwindling provisions was ambushed in a narrow defile and did not come back. The week after that, a messenger carrying dispatches from Murad's court to the siege commanders was intercepted on a mountain road, the dispatches taken, the messenger released with a message of his own to deliver. The message was, "This is what it costs to be here." Inside Kruja, Vrana Conti held. The Ottoman bombardment, when it began, was intense. Cannon fire that shook the limestone ridge and sent chips of stone flying like shrapnel across the interior of the fortress. The garrison repelled 3 direct assaults on the walls, each time at terrible cost, each time with men fighting from improvised positions behind rubble that the cannon had created. The Ottomans tried to tunnel under the walls, but the tunnel collapsed. They tried to bribe Conti with an offer of 300,000 aspra, Ottoman silver coins, plus a guaranteed high rank in the Ottoman military hierarchy. Conti refused, not with a speech, not with a proclamation about honour or freedom or God. He just refused and went back to inspecting the walls. The Ottomans tried again. They sent a delegation with an offer that was, by any objective measure, extraordinary. Money, rank, safety for the entire garrison, Conti's personal safety guaranteed by the Sultan's own word. Conti refused again. Months passed. The summer gave way to autumn. The Ottoman camp, spread across the hills below Kruja in its tens of thousands, began to suffer from the particular misery of a siege that is not going according to plan. The supply problems that Skanderbeg's raiding parties created were real, not cosmetic, not enough to starve 100,000 men, but enough to reduce them to short rations, to complicate the movement of reinforcements, to stretch the logistics system that kept the army functional to near its breaking point. Disease moved through the camp, as diseases do in crowded, ill-supplied conditions. Quietly at first, then with accelerating viciousness, then with a kind of urgency that makes commanders start calculating whether the objective is worth the cost. The Ottoman cannon had not breached the walls. The direct assaults had failed. The bribes had been rejected. The supply lines were bleeding, and then winter came to the Albanian mountains. Sultan Murad II, Murad the Conqueror, the man who had broken Hungarian crusader armies and reduced Byzantine territory to a single besieged city, lifted the siege of Kruja without having taken it. He gathered his army and marched east, leaving behind the wreckage of his supply depots and his campaign tents, and his certainty that this rebellion would be easy. Skanderbeg rode into Kruja that evening, through the gate his garrison had held for 6 months. Vrana Conti met him at the threshold, lean and hollowed from the months of siege, his face aged a decade in half a year. The two men looked at each other for a moment. No celebration, no speeches. Conti simply said, "The walls held." Skanderbeg looked up at the double-headed eagle still flying from the highest tower, undisturbed, black against the pale winter sky. "Yes," he said, "they held. But the Ottomans would come back. They always came back. And the next time they would bring what they had learned. It was not cannon that nearly broke Skanderbeg. It was a man he trusted. Moise Golem, sometimes called Moise Arianit Golemi, was one of Skanderbeg's principal military commanders, a man who had fought under the Albanian banner since the early days of the rebellion, who knew the tactics and the terrain and the faces of every significant fighter in the League. He was competent, experienced, and by every external measure committed to the cause. He was also, the Ottoman intelligence services had quietly determined, reachable. The approach was gradual. Gifts, flattery. The Sultan's agents had a long history of turning difficult men with exactly these tools, and they were patient. They understood that a man in Golem's position, fighting year after year with diminishing resources, watching the League fracture and reconcile and fracture again, seeing the cost of resistance in the faces of the Albanian people around him, was a man who might over time be brought to wonder whether the cause was truly winnable. In 1455, Skanderbeg made what he would later acknowledge was one of his few significant tactical errors. He laid siege to Berat, a strategically important Ottoman-held fortress in southern Albania. The siege progressed well initially, the Albanian force investing the position, beginning the systematic work of cutting it off and starving it into submission. Skanderbeg, dealing with a separate military crisis elsewhere in his territory, temporarily left the siege in the hands of his subordinate commanders. Golem was one of those commanders. What happened next came from two directions at once. An Ottoman relief force, estimated at 40,000 cavalry under the commander Isaac Bey, appeared on the horizon. That alone might have been survivable. Skanderbeg had dealt with Ottoman relief forces before. But simultaneously, at the moment when Albanian coordination and discipline were most critical, the formations near the rear of the Albanian position began to dissolve. Golem had opened a gap. The Ottoman cavalry poured through it before the Albanian commanders had time to react, striking the besieging force from behind, while the garrison inside Berat mounted a corresponding sortie from the walls. Caught between two forces, in terrain they had chosen for offence rather than defence. The Albanian army at Berat suffered one of the worst defeats of the entire 25-year war. The prisoners the Ottomans took were not ransomed. They were sent to Constantinople, where they were subjected to a death so deliberately public and so deliberately brutal that it functioned as a message. This is what rebellion costs. The women and children of Albanian fighters who were captured were enslaved. Skanderbeg received the news at Kruja with the face he always kept in moments of catastrophe, a mask of iron calculation, giving nothing away except for the one tick that men who knew him had learned to read, the way his upper lip would split from the pressure of his teeth when he was fighting his own rage. He rode out alone that night. No one knew where he went. When he came back, he called his commanders together. And he said something that the chronicles preserved because it was so unexpected. He said that what happened at Berat could have made the most loyal man falter. And he understood this. He did not call for Golem's death. He did not call for vengeance. He absorbed the loss, acknowledged what it had cost, and asked his commanders to do the same. The next spring, Golem led an Ottoman force of 15,000 cavalry back into Albania. Perhaps he expected Skanderbeg to be broken. Perhaps he had genuinely concluded that the rebellion could not survive. Perhaps the Ottoman gold had simply done its work. What he found at the valley of Oronik was Skanderbeg waiting for him. The battle was short. The terrain was Skanderbeg's terrain. The outcome was not close. And then something remarkable happened. Golem, his force destroyed, came to Skanderbeg and asked to return. He was not offering excuses. He was not constructing elaborate justifications for what he had done. He had been wrong. He had paid for it. He came back. Skanderbeg let him come back. This moment, this act of pragmatic, unsentimental, almost incomprehensible forgiveness, tells you more about Skanderbeg as a leader than any of his battlefield victories. He could not afford to kill every man who faltered. The rebellion was too small, too fragile, too dependent on the personal loyalties of individual commanders. He needed Golem's sword arm more than he needed the satisfaction of justice. And he had, perhaps, the wisdom to understand that a man who has betrayed you once and survived the shame of it is sometimes more loyal afterward than a man who has never been tested. Golem died in battle under the Albanian banner. He was buried as a soldier of the League. Phase 4. The Greatest Blow. Albania, September 2nd, 1457. What the Ottomans sent into Albania in the summer of 1457 was not just an army. It was a solution. Mehmed II had taken Constantinople 4 years earlier, the city that had stood for 1,000 years, the city whose walls had broken every attacker since the Romans built them, had fallen to his artillery on May 29th, 1453. Mehmed had entered it on horseback, through a breach in the walls, earning the title Fatih, the conqueror, and with it the absolute certainty of a man who has proved to himself that nothing is impregnable. Nothing. Not Constantinople's walls, not Albanian mountains, not Skanderbeg's reputation. But he was 25 years old, and he had already done what no one before him had managed. He was not patient with obstacles. The force he assembled for Albania in 1457 was commanded by 2 men chosen with surgical precision. Ishak Bey Ivrenos was a veteran commander who had fought in the Balkans for decades, experienced, methodical, unwilling to make the kind of overconfident errors that had destroyed earlier Ottoman commanders in Albanian terrain. And alongside him, as co-commander, rode Hamza Castrioti. Hamza was Skanderbeg's nephew. He had grown up watching his uncle fight. He knew the Albanian way of war, not from theory or captured intelligence reports, but from childhood, from years of riding with the Albanian army, from the kind of intimate knowledge that a blood relative acquires. He knew which valleys Skanderbeg preferred. He knew how his uncle thought about terrain, about timing, about the psychology of the men he commanded. He knew the signals and the symbols and the decision-making patterns of the Albanian high command with the precision of a man who had been inside the house. When Mehmed's agents approached Hamza, they brought more than gold. They brought an argument. The rebellion is dying. Your uncle will lose eventually. Why go down with the ship? Help us and survive. Help us and prosper. Hamza said yes. The Ottoman army, somewhere between 50,000 and 80,000 strong, the chronicles vary, but all agree it was enormous, entered Albania in late May 1457, moving through the Mat River Valley toward Kruje. Skanderbeg sent skirmishing forces forward to delay the vanguard, testing its composition, probing for weaknesses. But with Hamza at the Ottoman command table, every feint, every probe, every subtle signal that Skanderbeg's army projected was being read by a man who knew exactly what it meant. For 2 weeks, Skanderbeg was being outthought by his own blood. He understood this quickly. The evidence was there in the way the Ottoman vanguard responded to his feints, not with the slight delay of commanders relying on interpretation, but with the instant counter-movement of men who already knew the answer. Someone in that Ottoman camp had a map of Skanderbeg's mind. He stopped doing what they expected. He did not engage. He did not defend the obvious approaches. He did not use the standard Albanian withdrawal pattern that Hamza had watched him use a dozen times. He pulled his forces back into the hills north of the valley and went completely silent. For Ishak Bey and Hamza, unsure of Skanderbeg's location, decided not to besiege Kruja until they had dealt with the Albanian field army. They moved their main force into the open ground around a region called Albulena, Uje I Bardhe, the White Water, south of modern Las, and established a fortified camp. The position was good. Open ground that gave the Ottoman cavalry room to manoeuvre, protective hills to the north where they posted guards, their eastern flank secured. They waited. Silence. A day passed. 2 days. The Ottoman camp settled into its routine, the tension of expectation gradually giving way to the slightly dulled alertness of men who have been waiting for a battle that hasn't come. The guards on the northern hills watched carefully for the first day, and somewhat less carefully for the second, and by the third day were doing what guards always do after tension goes unrewarded. They were watching, but not quite as hard. On the morning of September 2nd, 1457, the Albanian army emerged from 3 directions simultaneously. Not from the north, where the guards were positioned, from the east, from the west, and from the south, cutting off the Ottoman retreat before the camp had time to realize it was being attacked from behind. The Ottoman camp, so well chosen for a waiting battle against an army that would approach from a predictable direction, was catastrophically positioned for an attack that came from every direction at once. The cavalry could not form up. The attack had reached the horse lines before the Sipahi could mount. The Janissaries, the finest infantry in the world, were lethal in formation, but their formation was a tent city in chaos. Men running in all directions, officers screaming contradictory orders into a roar of Albanian war cries and the screaming of horses. Hamza Castriotti, the man who had sold his uncle's secrets, found himself surrounded on a piece of ground he had chosen specifically because it seemed safe. He was captured alive. Ishak Bey fought his way out barely, but left behind the wreckage of the force he had commanded. The Ottoman dead at Albulena ranged in contemporary estimates from 15,000 to 30,000. Modern historians tend toward the conservative end of that range, but even at 15,000, this was a massacre. Another 15,000 were taken prisoner. 24 Ottoman battle standards, the symbols of unit identity and military honour, were captured. The camp, with all its supplies, its siege equipment, its treasury, and its intelligence documents, fell into Albanian hands. By sunset on September 2nd, 1457, the Albulena field was quiet. Skanderbeg stood at its centre as the last of the pursuit returned. Around him, Albanian fighters were moving through the captured camp, cataloguing what had been taken. Somewhere in the prisoner column, in chains, was his nephew. The Albanian commander did not say anything for a long time. He had won what historians would later call his most brilliant victory, the tactical masterpiece of his career, a battle in which he had adapted in real time to a threat that knew his own mind. He changed his patterns completely, and turned the enemy's intelligence advantage into a liability by becoming unpredictable. He had been betrayed by family and had answered the betrayal with genius. When the Ottoman delegation arrived a week later to discuss terms for ransoming the prisoners and the captured standards, Skanderbeg received them courteously and listened to their proposals. He had one demand: return Svetigrad and Berat, the fortresses the Ottomans had taken years earlier. Mehmed II refused. Skanderbeg said, "Then we continue." By 1460, even Mehmed the Conqueror had concluded that crushing Skanderbeg by force alone was not working. An armistice was signed. Albania had fought the Ottoman Empire to a negotiated standstill. For 3 years, there was something resembling peace. The armistice could not last, and everyone who signed it knew it. Skanderbeg used those 3 years furiously. He travelled to Italy, Meeting with Pope Pius II, who was genuinely excited by the Albanian resistance and saw in it the nucleus of a broader crusade, a final, coordinated Christian counterattack that would push the Ottomans back out of Europe entirely. He met with Ferdinand I of Naples, whose throne he had actually helped defend in 1460 to 1461, personally leading Albanian troops across the Adriatic Sea in an amphibious operation that his Italian allies had considered flatly impossible, to break a siege of Naples that seemed certain to succeed until Albanian cavalry arrived, and the besiegers suddenly discovered that the tactical situation had changed entirely. The Skanderbeg moved in European courts with the ease of a man who had been raised in the most sophisticated court in the region and had spent 25 years in the field. He could quote theology to the Pope, discuss Italian politics with the merchants of Venice, and then ride home to organize the defense of a mountain fortress. He was the most famous warrior in Europe. In Catholic churches from Portugal to Poland, his name was spoken in the context of saints and crusaders. But the crusade never came. Pope Pius II died in 1464, while his armies were still assembling, and with his death, the Grand Coalition collapsed like a sand castle before the tide. Skanderbeg's Italian allies mourned the Pope and went back to fighting each other, as Italian city-states perpetually did. Albania was alone. Mehmed II broke the armistice in 1466 and came personally to Albania with an army of 30,000, laying the second siege of Kruja. He was 34 years old, the conqueror of Constantinople, the most powerful ruler in the known world. He was also, by this point, genuinely furious, not with the cold, strategic fury of his father, but with something more personal. This Albanian, this former janissary, who should have been a loyal servant of the empire, had been making him look ridiculous for 20 years. The second siege of Kruja failed, as the first had failed. Mehmed came back in 1467 with an even larger force, attacking from multiple directions simultaneously, attempting to neutralize the mobile guerrilla tactics that had defeated every previous Ottoman attempt by reducing Skanderbeg's freedom of movement entirely. The Albanian commander adapted again, always adapting, always finding the angle that the Ottoman command structure was not quite flexible enough to cover. The third siege failed, but Albania was bleeding. The years of continuous warfare had taken a toll that no string of battlefield victories could entirely offset. Albanian villages lay in ruins. Fields had been burned too many times to count. The population had been reduced by casualties, by slavery, by refugees fleeing to Venice or Italy, or wherever they could find safety. The League's lords died one by one, and replacing them with men of equivalent quality and commitment became harder with each passing year. Skanderbeg himself was aging. He was 63 years old in 1467, which in the context of someone who had spent 35 years in constant military campaigning amounted to something more like 80. His body carried the accumulated damage of a lifetime of combat. He had survived siege and ambush and open battle and assassination attempts. He had buried friends and enemies, and increasingly the men he had trained himself. In the early winter of 1468, he travelled to Lesia, the same city where the League had been born 24 years earlier, to meet with the surviving Albanian lords and plan the strategy for what everyone understood would be another Ottoman offensive in the spring. He was already sick. The malaria that had been with him intermittently for years was, by January 1468, winning. His commanders could see it in the way he moved, in the effort it took him to maintain the physical presence that had always made him larger in any room than mere stature could explain. On January 17th, 1468, Gjergj Kastrioti, Skanderbeg, Lord of Albania, the man who had held back the Ottoman Empire for a quarter century, with 10,000 fighters and an intimate knowledge of what it felt like to be the enemy, died in Lesia. He was buried in the Cathedral of St. Nicholas. Word reached Mehmed II at his court. The conqueror's reaction was reportedly silence. Then, after a pause that the chronicles describe as very long, he said, "At last, Europe and Asia are mine. Woe to Christendom! She has lost her sword and her shield." It was, considering the source, the highest possible tribute. The silence after 25 years of war is a specific kind of silence. It is not peaceful. It does not feel like rest. It feels like the moment after a bell stops ringing, when the air still holds the shape of the sound, when the body still braces for the next stroke, when the mind has not yet caught up to the reality that the thing it was waiting for has ended. In the weeks following Skanderbeg's death on January 17th, 1468, Albania did not immediately collapse. The men who had fought under the double-headed eagle were not so easily broken, and the Ottoman army was not yet in position to capitalize. Leke Dukagjini, Skanderbeg's longtime rival within the League, the man who had questioned his loyalties 24 years earlier at Lesia and had reconciled with him half a dozen times since, took up what remained of the military command. He was competent. He was committed. He was not Skanderbeg. The arithmetic of the 25 years of war was stark. On the Albanian side, contemporary and near-contemporary sources suggest total military casualties across the entire period of between 20 and 30,000 dead, though given the guerrilla nature of the fighting, with its ambushes and raids and sieges, the true number of Albanian dead, soldiers and civilians combined, was certainly much higher. The great noble families of the League had been devastated, heirs killed in battle, family lines extinguished. The human capital of Albanian noble society spent over a generation of continuous warfare in ways that would take generations to rebuild. On the Ottoman side, the numbers are harder to establish with precision. But the historical consensus suggests something between 150,000 and 200,000 Ottoman soldiers killed in action against Albanian forces over the 25-year period, with additional tens of thousands wounded, captured or lost to the disease and privation that accompanied extended campaigns in difficult terrain. Individual battles alone account for staggering losses, perhaps 20,000 at Torviol, an estimated 15 to 20,000 at the first siege of Kruge, 15,000 or more at Albulena. The financial cost to the Ottoman treasury of conducting continuous military operations against a small mountain people for a quarter century was, even for an empire of vast resources, genuinely significant. The fate of the individuals who had shaped the war settled variously. Vrana Conti, Ian, who had held Kruja through 6 months of Ottoman siege in 1450 and refused the Sultan's most generous bribe, disappears from the historical record shortly after Skanderbeg's death, absorbed into the silence that swallows so many loyal subordinates when the leader they served is gone. What he did with the rest of his life, where he went, whether he survived the final collapse of Albanian resistance, history does not say. He had held the walls. That is what was recorded. That is what was remembered. Hamza Kastriotti, Skanderbeg's nephew, and the man who had sold Albanian military secrets to the Ottomans, was eventually released from captivity and returned to Ottoman service. He was never given significant command again. The Ottomans were not sentimental about men who had proven capable of betrayal. The very quality that made him useful to them was also the quality that made him permanently suspect in their eyes. He lived, he aged, he became a footnote. Moise Golem had already settled his account by the time Skanderbeg died. He had returned, been forgiven, fought again, and died in battle under the Albanian banner, receiving in death the dignity that his betrayal had forfeited and his return had reclaimed. His story is one of the few in this long war that ends with something resembling redemption. Gjon Kastriotti II, Skanderbeg's son, was a young man when his father died. He inherited the impossible legacy with the courage of someone who knew exactly how impossible it was and chose to shoulder it anyway. He continued resistance against the Ottomans in 1481 through 1484, launching campaigns that briefly recovered some of his father's former territories. But without the strategic genius and the personal authority that had held the League together, these efforts could not be sustained. The battlefield fell silent by stages. Leka Dukagjini held on through the late 1460s and into the 1470s, fighting with diminishing resources and diminishing territory, the League contracting around a smaller and smaller Albanian resistance. The Venetians, who had always played both sides, who had sold food to Ottoman besiegers even as they claimed friendship with Albanian defenders, negotiated their own accommodations with Mehmed as their interests shifted. In 1478, after a siege that lasted months and cost both sides terrible casualties, Kruji fell. And stand there for a moment in your mind. Kruja, whose walls had broken 3 Ottoman sieges under Skanderbeg, whose garrison had refused the Sultan's gold, whose tower had flown the double-headed eagle for 35 years. Kruja fell in 1478 to an Ottoman army that could finally, without Skanderbeg's mobile force harassing its supply lines, settle in and wait the defenders out. The walls that Vrana Conti had held were breached at last. The eagle came down. In 1479, Shkodra fell. The last major Albanian fortress in the north, another citadel that had resisted siege with extraordinary stubbornness, could no longer hold against an empire with all its attention now focused on consolidation rather than conquest. The Albanian resistance did not die quietly. It continued in fragmentary form. Local uprisings, guerrilla actions, its individual acts of defiance that the Ottoman administration had to suppress repeatedly throughout the 1480s and 1490s, but never again with the coordination and the leadership that had made it a genuine existential threat to Ottoman plans. In 1482, what scholars mark as the definitive end of organised Albanian resistance occurred. Ottoman rule over Albania was effectively complete. It would remain complete for 4.5 centuries. The aftermath unfolded in ways that no military map could have predicted. Thousands of Albanians, among them noble families, former soldiers, the craftsmen and scholars and clergy who had been part of the resistance community, fled westward across the Adriatic into southern Italy and Sicily. These communities, known as the Arberesha, carried with them the Albanian language, the Castrioti flag, the prayers and songs of a people who had fought for a quarter century and lost, but who refused to let what they had been dissolve into the empire that had swallowed their homeland. 500 years later, Arberesha communities still exist in southern Italy. They still speak a form of Albanian. They still remember Skanderbeg. The stone walls of Kruja stood through the centuries, battered and rebuilt and battered again on their limestone ridge above the Ishem Valley. They do not shout. They do not proclaim. They simply stand in the particular way that very old walls stand, bearing the weight of everything that happened against them and around them, saying nothing about it, outlasting the silence of the men who built them and defended them, and eventually could not hold them anymore. History rarely announces its turning points in real time. The men who fought at Torviol in 1444 did not know they were buying time for the Italian Renaissance to flourish unmolested. The garrison that held Kruja in 1450 did not know that their 6 months of endurance was part of the reason that Rome remained a Catholic city rather than an Ottoman one. Skanderbeg himself, riding through the mountains on his endless mobile campaigns, was not calculating his place in the long arc of European history. He was trying to survive long enough to fight the next battle, but the strategic consequences of what happened in Albania between 1443 and 1468 were enormous, and they rippled outward in ways that shaped the world we live in. Mehmed II died in 1481 without having conquered Rome. This is not a coincidence of timing. The 25 years of Albanian resistance had drained Ottoman resources, occupied Ottoman attention, and forced Ottoman strategic priorities away from the Western European targets that Mehmed, at his most ambitious, had genuinely contemplated. A Mehmed who had crushed Albania easily in 1444 or 1450 would have had those resources and that attention free for other purposes at exactly the moment when the Italian city-states were at their most fractured and the Papal states at their most vulnerable. The Albanian resistance did not win the war, but it changed the mathematics of the Ottoman advance in ways that its participants could not have calculated, and that historians are still analysing 600 years later. The tactical legacy was immediate and lasting. Skanderbeg's methods, the integrated use of terrain, the mobile strike force operating in conjunction with a defended strongpoint, the deliberate targeting of supply lines rather than enemy formations, were studied by European military thinkers within decades of his death. Machiavelli wrote about him. Voltaire wrote about him. Generals studying the problem of how a small force can resist a much larger one kept returning to the Albanian example because the Albanian example was the most successful anyone had managed in 5 centuries of trying. The political and cultural legacy was, if anything, even more profound. When the Albanian nationalist movement arose in the 19th century, when Albanian intellectuals began arguing against Ottoman resistance and European skepticism, that there was such a thing as an Albanian people, with a distinct identity deserving of self-determination, they reached back 4 centuries and found Skanderbeg. The double-headed black eagle that he had carried in his saddlebag the night he rode to Kruja became the centre of the Albanian national flag. His name became synonymous with resistance, with the idea that Albanian identity was worth fighting for, worth dying for, worth carrying across the Adriatic in the memory of exile communities and preserving through centuries of foreign rule. The equestrian statue that stands in the centre of Skanderbeg Square in Tirana, erected in 1968 on the 500th anniversary of his death during the communist era, when the Albanian government was looking for a hero who predated both capitalism and Christianity and yet was indisputably Albanian, looks east, toward the mountains, toward where the Ottoman armies came from. The gesture is not defiant in the way a raised fist is defiant. It is something quieter and more unsettling, the gaze of a man who knows what is coming and has decided to stand there anyway. Think about what Skanderbeg actually chose. He was 38 years old when he rode to Kruja. He had a career of genuine distinction in the most powerful military organisation in the known world. He had prestige, rank, the Sultan's personal favour, the prospect of continued advancement in an empire that rewarded competence without regard for ethnicity or origin. He could see, with the clarity that comes from having fought for the empire, exactly how its wars ended for the people who resisted it. He chose to come home anyway. Not because he was guaranteed to win, he was not. Not because God had promised him victory. He was a pragmatist, not a fanatic. Not because he didn't understand the odds. He understood them better than almost anyone alive. He chose it because some things matter more than survival, because there is a version of a life, comfortable, secure, distinguished, that is also a kind of slow death. And the man who was raised by strangers in a foreign court and given the name of Alexander the Great had apparently decided, somewhere in the long years of Ottoman service, that he would rather be himself for whatever time remained than be their instrument for the rest of a longer life. That choice, made in the dark on horseback, with a forged letter in a saddlebag, and 300 men who trusted him, is what the 25 years of war ultimately came back to. Not tactics, not terrain, not even military genius, though he had that in abundance. The willingness to stand in the place where the thing you love is being destroyed and say, not here, not today, not while I am alive. Centuries later, you can stand on the ridge at Kruja, and look down at the valley below, the same valley where Ottoman supply convoys once burned and where horsemen once chased soldiers through the dusk. The fortress is still there, rebuilt, maintained, turned now into a museum where school children walk through rooms that show the flags and the maps and the weapons of the resistance. The mountains look exactly as they looked in 1443. The same grey limestone, the same sharp angles. The same way the light falls differently on the western slopes than the eastern ones, a fact that every Albanian mountain fighter understood instinctively, and that every Ottoman commander had to learn, at cost, anew. The Ottoman Empire lasted another 4.5 centuries after Skanderbeg's death. It rose to even greater heights under Suleiman the Magnificent, and it fell, finally and completely, in 1922, when the last sultan was deposed and the Republic of Turkey was born from its ruins. The Castrioti bloodline, through Skanderbeg's son Gjon II, continued for generations as Dukes of Naples, the last trace of an Albanian sovereignty that had been purchased in blood and sustained by will. Albania remained part of the Ottoman Empire for 440 years. It gained independence in 1912, flying the same double-headed black eagle that Skanderbeg had carried in his saddlebag on the night he came home. His sword is held today in the Kunsthistorisches Museum in Vienna, a blade forged in Damascus, curved, elegant, still perfectly balanced, still capable of the swift, precise violence it was made for, still carrying in its steel the memory of the hands that held it. It has been 550 years. The walls of Kruja still stand, the eagle still flies, and the man who chose, against all reason and all odds, to come home, and in doing so held back an empire for 25 years, waits in stone in the centre of Tirana's main square, looking east toward whatever is coming next. Some men are measured by the empires they built. Skanderbeg is measured by the empire he refused.